Mr. President,
Senate Majority Leader.
we in a quorum call.
The Senate is in a quorum call.
I ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, now is the time to put country before party. That was an observation by the Democratic leader just yesterday here on the Senate floor. Our friend from New York makes a good point, and I'm hopeful that it's a principle his own caucus will follow in the days to come. We're no longer in the midst of a contentious presidential election. We have a new president, and that president has now put forth an exceptional Supreme Court nominee and a number of well-qualified cabinet nominees. And yet, more than 2 weeks into his term, President Trump has the fewest cabinet secretaries confirmed at this point than any other president since George Washington. The president deserves to have his cabinet in place. The American people deserve that as well. I would remind our Democratic colleagues of the things they themselves have said when the shoe was on the other foot. Here's what their last vice presidential candidate, our colleague from Virginia, had to say. I think we owe deference to a president for choices to executive positions. So yes, now is the time, as the Democratic leader said, to put country before party. One way to do so is by ending the unprecedented delay we've seen by Democrats on the president's cabinet appointments. Our colleagues will have an opportunity to chart a different path later this afternoon and the rest of the week as we vote to confirm more nominees. This afternoon, we'll vote on the president's nominee for Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos. I look forward to confirming her to this important position so that she can get to work on behalf of America's students and schools. As I said yesterday, this well-qualified candidate has earned the support of several education groups and nearly 24 governors from across the nation. She understands that teachers, students, parents, school boards, and state and local governments, not Washington bureaucrats, are best suited to make education decisions for our kids. And I know she's committed to improving our education system so that every child has a brighter future. After we confirm Ms. DeVos, the Senate will turn to another well-qualified cabinet nominee, our own colleague, Senator Jeff Sessions of Alabama. We all know Senator Sessions, and we know him to be a man of his word. We know he's a man who believes in the rule of law. We know him as someone who is willing to work with anyone, regardless of party, like when he teamed up on legislation with Democratic colleagues like Senator Durbin and our late colleague, Ted Kennedy. I would remind Democratic colleagues that Republicans did not filibuster when a newly elected President Obama put forward his own Attorney General nominee, Eric Holder. In fact, the nominee who will soon be before us, Senator Sessions, crossed the aisle to vote for Eric Holder. This, despite the fact that the Holder nomination in our party and the Republican conference here in the Senate was one steeped in considerable controversy. What a contrast with the way the Democrats are now treating our colleague's own nomination now. They're looking to waste even more time for its own sake today. It's been unfortunate to hear the attacks that some on the far left have directed at our friend over the past few weeks. But I'm pleased the American people have had the opportunity to learn the truth about Senator Sessions and to see for themselves how qualified he is to lead the Justice Department. We can expect that Senator Sessions in his new role will continue fighting to protect the rights and freedoms of all Americans as he also defends the safety and security of our nation. Tomorrow I'll have more to say about Senator Sessions and the impact he's had on each of us here in the Senate. But for now, I'd encourage colleagues to finally come together and show him and each of those remaining nominees the fair consideration that they deserve.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Democratic
I
leader.
ask unanimous consent the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Okay. It's not my microphone, so it's different. Lefty versus righty microphones, Mr. President. Okay, now, I've just listened to my friend the Majority Leader, Mr. President, and the Majority Whip on the floor. They're able legislators, but they're sort of misleading the public as to the motivation. They've tried to, of our motivation, they've tried to paint every Democratic request as leftover resentment from the election. Sour grapes, the Majority Leader said a few weeks ago. They can say it day after day after day, but it'll never be true. All we Democrats are insisting on is careful consideration of nominees who we believe almost universally are below par. These nominees are going to have tremendous effect on the American people. Every mother and father in America should worry about Betsy DeVos's lack of dedication, almost negative feelings about public education. She heaps abuse on public education. 90% of our children are in public schools. Of course there should be discussion about her. She shouldn't be the nominee. Yeah, I understand our colleagues on the other side of the aisle, it's a new president. My guess, Mr. President, if you went in their cloakroom and heard their whispers, our Republican colleagues were saying, I wish he could have come up with someone else. Because Betsy DeVos is the negative trifecta. Negative on competence. She doesn't even understand the basic aspects of education. Negative on philosophy. She disdains public education, where 90% of our kids are. And negative on ethics. Her conflicts of interest are legion, and she hasn't, unlike some other of the cabinet nominees, tried to erase them. So, of course there should be a tremendous amount of discussion. Of course Democrats ought to bring to light who Betsy DeVos is. And so when she does her acts as secretary, when she does things that hurt public education as secretary, the American people know what's happening and can stand up against it. You know, Mr. President, I have to tell you, it's not Democrats who are bitter about the election. It's the American people who are bitter about the nomination of Betsy DeVos, and that's why millions and millions of calls, almost unprecedented on a cabinet nomination, have poured into this Capitol, into Democratic and Republican offices alike. That is why the distinguished chairman of this committee, who is a dear friend, I have such respect and admiration for him, we've spent time together socially, but he was put in the awkward position of having to rush through a nominee, 5 minutes of questions. That's it for each senator. 5 at night, no second rounds. There was no rationale for that other than he was afraid of what she would say or might not say. And sure enough, when she testified, those fears were actualized because Betsy DeVos couldn't answer the most fundamental questions about public education. She couldn't get her paperwork in on time. What kind of nominee is that? How is somebody who's going to run the Department of Education with tens of thousands of employees unable to get their paperwork to clear the ethics organizations? How is she unable to get her paperwork in on time? Every nominee of President Obama did. And we didn't hear from them until they did. The rush, few extra days, some hours last night, so we might examine a nominee who has tremendous power over the future of millions of American kids and their families? Oh, no. If anything, we should be spending more time on Betsy DeVos, not less. What should be happening is she should go back for a second hearing, now that her paperwork is in. What should happen is she should be asked more questions because she was so unable to answer so many rudiments last time. What should happen is there should be more time, not less, on debating this nominee, not because we want to be dilatory, but because we want a nominee who at least meets some basic tests. And she does not. And that is why there will be every Democrat voting against her, and 2 Republicans who showed tremendous courage. Again, I've been around here a while. I know the pressures. And that's why I have such respect for the senators from Alaska and Maine who voted against Betsy DeVos, not for political considerations, not in frustration that they lost the election, but because they knew how bad she would be for public education, because their states are largely rural. And in rural America, there is not much choice, which has been Betsy DeVos's watchword, although the charter schools she has set up have been, by and large, a failure. But they don't have that choice. So someone who decries public education, who disdains public education, is not good for their states, and I would dare say is not good for the states of a lot of senators on the other side of the aisle who feel compelled out of party loyalty to vote for her. In fact, Mr. President, when you talk about parties demanding things, it's the Republican side demanding a vote for an unqualified candidate, not the Democrats delaying her at a peak, because we're not. So, I hope, against hope, that another Republican will have the courage of the senators from Alaska and Maine and join us. And then what can happen is the president will get to make the nomination. We Democrats aren't going to pick the Secretary of Education, but it'll be a qualified nomination because they will have learned their lesson in the White House that they can't rush through these nominations with such little vetting. Now, I'd like to say a word, we'll be saying more later, on Senator Sessions, who will be coming forward after we vote on Ms. DeVos at noon today. Now, the nominee for Attorney General has huge importance, far greater importance than the nominee would have had 3-4 weeks ago. And we need a lot of discussion on that. What we've seen is a president who belittles judges when they don't agree with him. What we've seen is a president who is willing to shake the roots of the Constitution and a fundamental premise, no religious test, that's embodied in our Constitution within his first few weeks in office. So we certainly need an Attorney General who will stand up to that president. We've seen other Attorneys General do it, most notably in the Clinton administration. Senator Sessions, I ride with him on the bike in the gym, but he is not, if you can say one thing about him, he's not independent of Donald Trump. He supported Donald Trump from the very beginning. Even when Donald Trump didn't look like he was going to be much of a candidate, and if you had to pick someone who would not stand up to a president when the president goes too far, well, let's put it the other way. If you had to pick someone who would stand up to a president when the president goes too far, on picking on the judiciary, on avoiding the tenets, breaking the tenets of the Constitution, whatever the legal case shows, you wouldn't pick Jeff Sessions. And his record is clearly troubling. We'll hear a lot more about it later. He is probably the most anti-immigrant member of this body, Democrat or Republican. And Many of us on this side believe immigrants are an asset to America, not a liability. Many on the other side of the aisle probably do too. When it comes to voting rights, so important, so fundamental, and under attack right now, again, Jeff Sessions has not been stalwart. He has had a record that leaves much, much to be desired. And on the issue of civil rights as well, Senator Sessions' record is not a record that I think anyone who believes in civil rights could admire. We just had an acting attorney general stand up to the president. That's going to be a real test in this administration, because there seems so little regard for an independent judiciary and even for the Constitution itself. That is probably the most important quality of this new Attorney General. And I have to say, as much as I agree with Jeff Sessions on an issue like trade, he's the wrong choice for Attorney General. He would be at any time because of his record on immigration, civil rights, and voting rights, but particularly wrong now because we need someone who has some degree of independence from the president. So, Mr. President, I'm going to yield the floor. I hope one of our Republican colleagues will step up to the plate in a few hours. But even if they don't, we Democrats are very proud of what we have done here, because the nominee is so unqualified, and the American people now know it. And that is an important tenet of this democracy, for an informed public to understand who's running the government. And I hope that my colleagues will listen to our arguments for the sake of America, not for any partisan sake, about the Attorney General in these very troubled times when it comes to an independent judiciary and the Constitution of the United States. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Mexico.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me, first of all, begin by thanking Senator Murray for her leadership in terms of leading us to scrutinize this nominee, Betsy DeVos. It seems to me the more we dig into this, the more we look at it, the worse it gets. And so I rise today in strong opposition to the confirmation of Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education. Ms. DeVos is nominated to lead our nation's public education system, yet she has worked for decades to privatize it and even to create profit-making centers. She wants to siphon public funds to private schools. She has led a multi-million-dollar lobbying campaign to fund private, religious, and for-profit schools with public education dollars. We can all agree that we want our nation's schools to be the very best they can be. We want our children to have all the opportunities we can provide. But that really is the issue. That is why Democrats have held the floor all night long to do everything in our power to convince the Senate to reject this nomination. I believe in the public school system. I want all of our children to have opportunities. That is the fundamental principle of our American school system. Everyone should be able to get a great education. Ms. DeVos wants to dismantle our public schools. She would drain resources from the children and teachers who need it the most. Mr. President, I can't say it strongly enough. A vote for Ms. DeVos is a vote to destroy our public school system. My constituents agree. We have received over 63,000 emails and over 2,000 telephone calls in the last month alone, opposing this nomination. These are record-breaking numbers from my office for a cabinet nominee. Many of those calls and letters are from public school parents and teachers, men and women who are dedicated to our students and our public education system. They understand that Betsy DeVos is not qualified to lead our nation's public education system. Betsy DeVos is the first nominee in history for Secretary of Education with no experience in education or public administration. She's not a teacher. She's not a school administrator. She didn't attend public schools. Her children didn't attend public schools. She has never held a government position, let alone one in education. In fact, she has open disdain for government. Ms. DeVos' complete lack of experience and profound lack of understanding of educational policy were on full display during her confirmation hearing. Under questioning, it was clear that Ms. DeVos was completely uninformed about the ongoing debate in education policy between proficiency and growth. This issue is critical. It is well documented. There is a correlation between test scores and student socioeconomic status and race. So evaluating schools based on average test scores tends to penalize schools with large numbers of low-income and racial minority students, even if those schools produce significant student growth on math and reading test scores. Proficiency or growth is one of the most basic education policy questions. And yet the president's nominee for education, the Secretary of Education, doesn't understand the issue. Maybe this is because she has been single-mindedly focused on feeding private, for-profit charter schools with public dollars, and the religious and other private schools through vouchers. And so her knowledge about education is limited to her pet issue. Valerie Sayal, who taught in public schools in New Mexico for 13 years, observed that Ms. DeVos has not bothered to do her homework for the hearing. It is clear that Ms. DeVos does not have the breadth or depth in education policy or finance to be the Secretary of Education. Mr. President, Senator Hassan has a son who has cerebral palsy. She told us a moving story about the good education he received in the New Hampshire public schools, despite his disability, because of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or the IDEA. Senator Hassan asked if Ms. DeVos would require schools using vouchers to comply with that law. Ms. DeVos initially responded that she believes the decision should be left to the states. When Ms. DeVos was informed that it's federal law, that it's not up to the states, she responded she must have been, quote, confused. Confused? Ms. DeVos brags she's been an education advocate for 30 years. The IDEA was passed over 25 years ago in 1990. Ms. DeVos was not confused. She plainly did not know what the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act is. It's very disturbing that she appears not to know how public schools educate and accommodate kids with special needs. Does she not know what an individual education plan is? She didn't know, as she said in a hearing to be Secretary of Education, that millions of public school children with disabilities have a federal right to a free and appropriate education. It is just as troublesome that Ms. DeVos did not know that children with disabilities can lose their federal right to an equal education under state voucher programs. Voucher programs she spent years advocating for. She did not know that voucher programs can require students with disabilities to sign away their IDEA rights. And most troubling of all, she would not commit to making sure voucher programs comply with the law. I am also quite concerned that Ms. DeVos fails to appreciate the important role that tribal cultures play in educating Native American children. This nation has a solemn trust and treaty responsibility to provide quality education to Native students, both through the public school system and the Federal Bureau of Indian Education. Her testimony has proven that she is uneducated about these students as well. Many states have significant tribal populations. My home state of New Mexico, it's about 10%. And as Vice Chair of the Indian Affairs Committee, my job is to make sure that any education secretary is committed to respecting tribal sovereignty and self-determination. Ms. DeVos has given me no assurance she understands, cares about, or is prepared to address the needs of Native American students. Nothing in her hearing or written answers convinced me that she will respect tribal cultures or tribal sovereignty or the right to self-determination. In fact, her lobby organization, American Federation for Children, supports the expansion of vouchers into Indian country, diverting money from tribal schools to private schools. I cannot support taking money away from schools run by tribes and losing that self-determination effort that tribes are making. The National Indian Education Association has said, and I quote here, "Federal funding should not be moving over to a private school system. Move out of our tribally run school system into a system that does not require consultation and does not require active engagement of Native communities," end quote. I couldn't agree more on that, and she just shows a basic lack of understanding of tribal sovereignty and self-determination. Betsy DeVos seems to be driven by her personal religious views. I respect the strength of her Dutch Calvinist religious beliefs, but her imposing her religious beliefs should have no place in funding public education, which serves children of all beliefs. In 2001, she talked about whether Christian schools should continue relying on contributions instead of vouchers. And Ms. DeVos said, and I'm quoting here, "There are not enough philanthropic dollars in America to fund what is currently the need in education. Our desire is to confront the culture in ways that will continue to advance God's kingdom," end quote. I support her right to devote her philanthropic dollars to her church and other religious efforts, but I oppose her view of using public dollars to advance her view of God's kingdom in public schools. Separation of church and state is a fundamental principle in our democracy to protect people and communities from religious coercion by the government. And I'm concerned that Ms. DeVos does not have the necessary respect for other people's religious beliefs, and that her policies could disregard the importance of tribal perspectives on education. We need assurance that every public school student, no matter their religion, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation or identity, ability or disability, will be respected, protected, and included. At the highest levels in Washington, D.C., that is the job of the Secretary of Education. Ms. DeVos has not shown over the many decades she has lobbied on education that she agrees with this basic proposition. Mr. President, I support making good quality public school options available. There are many great public charter and magnet schools around the country. We have some good ones in New Mexico, but these public schools should meet the same accountability standards as other public schools, standards for student achievement, teacher performance, and fiscal responsibility. I also support the option of private and religious schools. We have great private and religious schools in our country, but public dollars must go to public schools, not private or religious schools, and certainly not private for-profit schools. The first objective of any for-profit venture is to make money. That cannot be the first objective of a school using public funds. The first and foremost objective of public education funds should be education of students. And when public dollars are used, their use must be fully accountable and transparent to the public. Betsy DeVos would not commit that private for-profit charter schools and voucher schools should have the same accountability standards as public schools. Why didn't she make this commitment? Likely because the private charter schools in Michigan funded by public dollars that she has championed for decades do not have to meet the same accountability standards as public schools. This is wrong. These same schools, her work for decades, have not shown appreciable gains in Michigan over the years. In fact, Michigan test scores have gone down over time. These schools have not shown significant improvement over public schools in Michigan. Finally, Mr. President, I'm not convinced that Ms. DeVos has been transparent in her responses to the American public. She did not make her disclosures available to the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee at the time of her confirmation hearing. This is unprecedented, and the committee had no opportunity to look into her many financial conflicts. Since then, she has entered into an agreement with the Office of Government Ethics, and while she will divest from approximately 100 investments that pose a conflict, we do not know if she is divested from all of her conflicts. Ms. DeVos benefits from 3 trusts. She has not disclosed the assets in 2 of those trusts. The complexity and enormity of Ms. DeVos's $5 billion holdings is mind-boggling. We know from one trust that at least 100 conflicts required divestment. Without transparency in other trusts, the public does not know if she has any more conflicts. Mr. President, I also want to raise the issue of Ms. DeVos's unwillingness to address her PAC's unpaid $5.3 million fine in the state of Ohio for violating campaign finance laws. This situation is troubling on a number of levels. First, Ms. DeVos led a multi-million-dollar political effort to influence elections throughout our nation. Second, while doing so, Ms. DeVos's Political Action Committee willfully ignored campaign finance laws and warnings from state election officials. She racked up an unprecedented $5.3 million fine in Ohio. And third, rather than acknowledging that she broke the law and owning up to her responsibility to pay it, her PAC simply folded up shop and walked away. Mr. President, as Secretary of Education, Ms. DeVos will be responsible for overseeing college loans for millions of students, yet she refuses to acknowledge or pay her own debts. Does she believe that the law doesn't apply to her? I've written to Ms. DeVos and the Help Committee several times demanding answers about this. Her responses were evasive. She refuses to pay the fine, hiding behind the corporate veil while still paying lawyers to fight it. This is hypocrisy on the top of disregard of the law. We have never had a cabinet nominee who led a dark money PAC, which broke the law and flouted the judicial system. This is absolutely, totally unprecedented. Mr. President, for all these reasons, I must vote no on the confirmation of Ms. DeVos as Secretary of the Department of Education. Mr. President, I note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
President.
Senator from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senate isn't a quorum call.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the quorum call.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. President, it's pretty clear. It's pretty simple. There never has been a nominee for Secretary of Education as unqualified as Betsy DeVos. That's clear to pretty much every member of this body. Not that every member of this body is going to stand up and vote the way that probably their conscience suggests they do, whether they like her ideology or not, whether they like her hundreds of millions of dollars they've contributed to all kinds of political campaigns or not. They clearly understand this nominee from her performance and her lack of depth of knowledge of education that she's simply not qualified. As many have said on this floor, based on her confirmation hearing, it appears she has a complete lack of knowledge as to what the Department of Education actually does. She didn't seem to understand the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which requires public schools to provide free and appropriate education to all students with disabilities. I think that when I first ran for Congress some years ago, I assume it's the same for the presiding officer. I know it's the same for the ranking Democrat from Washington State who sits here in this chamber and who has led the opposition to Betsy DeVos. From my first days in Congress, every time I met with school boards, every time I met with teachers, every time I met with school administrators, with principals, they would talk to me about IDEA. They'd talk to me about school districts and the costs and their obligation and duty and desire to serve these students. Yet the designee for Secretary of Education sort of put her hands up when there was discussions in the Committee of Individuals with Disability Education Act. It's astonishing that a nominee for Secretary of Education would demonstrate complete ignorance on something as crucial and important to public school education, to education as a whole, on this. But it isn't her hearing performance alone that should disqualify her, it's her record. No experience with public schools at all. The President of the United States has nominated for Secretary of Education someone with no experience in public schools at all. Not as a teacher, not as administrator, not as a student, not even as a parent. Nothing. Her only experience in education is a wealthy donor inheriting millions and tens of millions of dollars herself. Her only experience in education is a wealthy donor who spent millions of dollars advocating for profit, not charter schools like KIPP and Breakthrough in my state, but for-profit charters in her state. The same policy that has ripped off taxpayers and failed students in Ohio. It betrays students and it undermines and fleeces taxpayers. It's obvious if she and her family hadn't donated $200 million to Republicans and to conservative causes, there's no chance someone this unqualified would ever have been nominated for a position as exalted, as crucial, as important as Secretary of Education. $200 million apparently is a price for the cabinet slot. So much for the president's campaign promise of draining the swamp. We see nominee after nominee, appointee after appointee coming from Wall Street. And now we see a $200 million contributor has also earned a cabinet slot. Because of her crusade, more than 80% of Michigan's charter schools are operated for profit. She helped design one of the least effective charter school systems in the country in Detroit. I know this, and this matters to me because I know a lot about what's happened with for-profit charter schools in Ohio. For-profit charters have failed in Ohio. They've led to a charter school sector, again, taking out KIPP and Breakthrough and the good charters that we've seen in Ohio. We've seen a charter school sector that has wasted taxpayers' money, that has funneled it to unaccountable for-profit companies and been plagued by scandal after scandal. I take that personally in Ohio because I know how students have been betrayed by this for-profit sector, and I know how taxpayers have been fleeced in my state in this for-profit sector, and I know the devastation it leaves behind in less money, fewer dollars for public schools. People call my state, regrettably, the wild, wild west of charter schools. What a name to earn. Ohio is the wild, wild west of for-profit charter schools. Our students suffer as a result. Students in public schools, students in for-profit charter schools, students in not-for-profit charter schools as a result. The last thing we need to do is take the wild, wild west model in Ohio, or even worse, the for-profit charter school structure and model in Michigan, and replicate it at a national level. Public schools, this is important to remember. Of all the students in the country, K through 12, public schools educate 90% of them. 90% of the students in this country. Betsy DeVos called traditional public education a dead end. Dead end for whom? She called traditional public education a dead end. Think of what we've done in this country. From 1789, when George Washington took the oath of office, up until now, public education has built this country. It's given all kinds of people opportunity, given all kinds of people a chance to get ahead, educated our children. We should be proud of our public school system, and we may confirm in the vote today a nominee who called public education, traditional public education, a dead end, someone who's never worked in a public school, never gone to a public school, never been a parent of somebody in a public school. She said she doesn't think that all schools that receive taxpayer dollars, whether they're public or for-profit charter, should be held to the same standards of accountability. To me, one of the most telling moments of the committee is she would not commit to the same accountability standards for-profit charters as she did public schools. You know why? Because she knows her for-profit charters that she's so proud of that they don't live up to the same standards, that they're simply not as good. That's why she doesn't want accountability measures applied equally to for-profit charters as public education has. In Michigan, she fought a rescue plan for Detroit public schools that would have finally provided accountability for charter schools. No, she's against that. Why have lower standards for for-profit charter schools? Maybe that's because, I don't know about her investments. I don't think she's disclosed everything to the committee, but neither did Secretary-designee Mnuchin, neither did Secretary-designee Price, neither did Secretary-designee, and I can go on and on and on. But she doesn't want the same accountability for profit charters because it might hurt some of her investor friends. She funneled think of this, $25,000, mostly inherited money, every day to legislators in Michigan until this accountability proposal was defeated. Average, probably not $25,000 every single day, but over time averaged $25,000 a day to legislators in Michigan so she could have her way. Talk about draining the swamp, Mr. President, really. Yet she can't seem to come up, and this I take personally too, with the $5 million she owes to Ohio taxpayers for violating state election laws. What's that about? Well, she came into Ohio with a political action committee that she mostly funded, that she was involved in a number of ways. The Ohio Elections Commission and Ohio officials, in a nonpartisan way, found her guilty of campaign finance law violation. This committee was assessed a $5 million fine, but guess what? She quit putting money in this committee because she didn't want it to be subject to the fine. So our Attorney General has not gone after her. He wants to be governor, and he's a member of her party, and who knows, I don't know their relationship or much care, but she's depriving our state of $5 million that she owes through this committee. Legally, she's found a way with very expensive lawyers to kind of weasel out of it, to navigate her way through it. But the fact is, by any standards of decency, she owes my state $5 million. That could be 60 or 70 or 80 teachers. She cares about education, but she's, paying the $5 million fine is probably like me paying $50. I mean, she is she's a billionaire. $5 million won't break her. She'll hardly notice it. But she's going to be in charge of a Department of Education which collects student loan debt, but she doesn't pay her student loan debt with people coming out of school making $30,000 or $40,000 or $50,000 a year, burdened with tens of thousands of student loan debt, and struggle every month to make those payments, yet she owes $5 million, and she just says, sorry, I'm not going to pay it. So she is going to, through this confirmation process, she won't even pay the debt of $5 million. Are my colleagues on the Republican side of the aisle, they're going to just say, oh, it's okay to nominate her and confirm her, even though she owes this money to my state. She sent us a letter back finally last week, because I asked her to explain herself and to promise to repay taxpayers in my state. She sent us a letter back last week, again refusing to take any personal responsibility for the legal action of this political action committee she founded. She chaired it at the time it broke the law. She paid the legal bills for it, but she wouldn't pay the fine that this committee owes, saying, I don't know it. Is that who you want? Is that the kind of person you want in terms of personal integrity, personal responsibility? I don't know how many times I've been preached at in this body by my colleagues on personal responsibility that they say Democrats don't take for whatever they say it for, but she won't pay her $5 million debt. Again, she founded the Political Action Committee. She chaired it at the time she broke the law. She paid the legal fees for it, but she won't pay the money that she owes that could hire 60, 70, 80 teachers in my state. She spent millions pushing the same for-profit education model agenda that's ripped off Ohio taxpayers and shortchanged our students. You know, most people in this country used to think that billionaires are not above the law, that in fact, some people, 3 million fewer than voted for the other candidate, but some people voted for this president because he said he drained the swamp. But if billionaires are in fact above the law, it's how to argue, and that we're not holding accountable to American students, as Betsy DeVos, as Secretary of Education, it's hard to argue that billionaires are not above the law. She's opposed by the disability community, she's opposed by civil rights community, she's opposed by a number of people in the more legitimate charter school community. She's opposed by teachers. Even the National Association of Principals has come out against her nomination. Something, if Senator Murray's words are correct, and I know they are about this because we've talked to them, this is the first time in history that the Association of Principals has come out against the Secretary of Education. I can't support Betsy DeVos because I can't look Ohio parents in the eye and tell them she won't put profits ahead of their children's education. Our children deserve to deserve better than that. Now, Mr. President, I'll come back in closing to beginning my comments about the Individual Disability Education Act, about which she knew nothing, or who knew little. And I think about that, and I think, how could a Secretary of Education designee who prides herself on knowing a lot about education, how could she not know much about IDEA? And then it occurred to me, if you're running a for-profit charter school, you don't want disabled kids coming to your school. Why? Because it costs more to educate a disabled child than it does with a child without any disabilities. Costs more because you might need more use of a nurse, you might need a student aid, you might need wheelchair accessibility, you might need special tutoring. So it costs more to educate a disabled child. So a for-profit charter school doesn't want children with disabilities to walk through their doors or to come into a wheelchair through their doors, because they can't make as much money. So this is how we do privatization in this country. Let the public schools take care of the child with disabilities, because we're in this for profit. It's a little bit like Medicare. The private for-profit insurance companies want the youngest, healthiest people in Medicare, the 65 and 70-year-olds that are active, that take walks, that do all that. They don't really want the sickest and the oldest. Let taxpayers pay for them. That's exactly what her model of education is all about. Let the for-profit charters skim the cream, if you will, take the children that cost the least and are easiest to educate. Let the public schools take care of the children with disabilities. Let the public schools take care of the children that maybe didn't have as much advantage in life as Betsy DeVos growing up. Let the public schools worry about the kids that might be a little bit more difficult because of discipline and other issues because of what's going on at their homes. That's pretty clear how she looks at the world and how she looks at this job, and most importantly, how she looks at education in our country. That's what disturbs me. That fundamentally, Mr. President, is why I oppose Betsy DeVos, and I plan to vote emphatically today no.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I want to thank the senator from Ohio for his passionate remarks on this topic. I have been had the opportunity over most of Friday and over the last 22 hours, 23 hours, to listen to my colleagues come to the floor and speak passionately about an issue they care about, speaking against DeVos. We've heard very little passion speaking for Betsy DeVos, but we've heard a tremendous amount of passion, and I want to thank the senator from Ohio in particular, speaking to the issue of the fact that Ms. DeVos does owe a fine to Ohio that has not been paid. And I find it incredulous that we are just dismissing that here, and senators are voting for her. The senator from Ohio spoke passionately about what vouchers would mean for students with disabilities, and their ability to get a good education could be in jeopardy over the vision that this secretary's brought forward. I listened to the senator from New Mexico a few moments ago speak about many of our tribal schools and the fact that this Secretary of Education has no knowledge of tribal education and her role in being in charge of that, with no experience, no idea of what that means or how that will be enacted. And again, I want to just say that we've heard from so many people in our states, because we clearly have a nominee for to run the Department of Education with no experience and a background that is really in opposition to what most of us have stood up for and fought for most of our lives. I have mentioned throughout this debate, as I've spoken numerous times, about the tremendous amount of letters that have come to me through our mail over the last several weeks since this nominee came before our committee and the public had a chance to see Ms. DeVos at our hearing without the knowledge that she needs to lead this agency, with the tremendous conflicts of interest that were portrayed over and over. And I want to, again, go back and read some of those letters as we get into the last hour of this debate, because I think they are quite telling. I have one from Dr. Jennifer K. Lynn of Olympia, Washington, and she says to me, "Thank you for your understanding that Betsy DeVos would devastate U.S. public education. Betsy DeVos's Senate confirmation hearing underscored how unprepared she is to serve as America's Secretary of Education. Mrs. DeVos has no experience in public schools, either as a student, an educator, administrator, or even as a parent. Mrs. DeVos doesn't understand key policy issues like proficiency versus growth, or the federal role of the Individuals with Disabilities Act. Mrs. DeVos would not even commit to upholding current guidance on preventing sexual assault under Title IX. Ms. DeVos has no idea of how the arts and public education are critical for human development. Education in all of the arts helps our students grow emotionally, with dedication to tasks, grow more and more connections in the brain, and perhaps most importantly, find out how much the arts enhance their lives. We need a Secretary of Education who will champion innovative strategies that we know help to improve success for all students, including creating more opportunities and equity for all. Betsy DeVos is not that person, and I urge you to vote against her for Secretary of Education." Again, those aren't my words. I didn't talk to Jennifer Lynn. She wrote to me because she saw this candidate come before our committee. She has looked at her record and has said, this is not what our country's about. I got a letter from Jamie Michelson of Oroville, Washington, very small community. "Senator Murray, as a public school administrator, I am extremely concerned about Betsy DeVos's lack of knowledge and support for public schools. Having never been a teacher or administrator is bothersome enough, but to have not attended a public school herself nor sent her kids to one makes her ill-equipped to making educational decisions. Furthermore, I worry about her understanding of small, rural districts. We have our own unique needs, which include funding professional development for teachers, federally funded programs for at-risk youth, and support to recruit and retain high-quality teachers. As a strong supporter of public education, I ask that you oppose the confirmation of Betsy DeVos as Secretary of the U.S. Department of Education. We must have a secretary who can commit to supporting every student in all public schools and provide leadership that will help our neighborhood schools succeed. Betsy DeVos's record in education and her performance at the recent confirmation hearing prove she is the wrong candidate for the job. As a principal, I have spoken with teachers, parents, students, and community members who agree that America's future depends on a strong investment in our nation's public schools. Thank you for your attention to this matter. I understand that you are being inundated with emails right now concerning cabinet picks. I feel that the nomination of Betsy DeVos is political. Students, families, and educators deserve a highly qualified candidate that understands our complex educational system. I'm not writing to you because I have a political motivation. Instead, I am looking for the best of the best for the Secretary of Education position. Unfortunately, in my professional opinion, Betsy DeVos is not the right person for this job. Mr. President, I couldn't agree more. Shouldn't we have the best of the best at the top of our education system today? That's what my constituents are asking, and I know many across this country, and they are hoping that just one more Republican senator will agree. That's what will occur in about an hour, and I see my colleague on the floor who's come here to talk, and I appreciate his being here, and will yield the floor.
I want to thank Senator Murray for...
Senator from Delaware is recognized.
Thank you for yielding, but thank you even more for your leadership on this issue, and God knows how many others. You're a force of nature, and happy to be with you on this day. I'm coming from Delaware, and we have about 1 million people who live in Delaware, and they're not shy about telling our congressional delegation, Senator Coons and Congresswoman Lisa Blunt Rochester and me what they're thinking. And we go home just about every night, and so they get to tell us a lot of times in person. They also call our office. We have 3 offices in Delaware. They call our office here in Washington. They send us emails. We used to get a lot of letters, but now mostly receive emails, not too many letters. But I've never seen the kind of outcry, if you will, from the people of my state on any nomination. I've been privileged to serve here. This is my 17th year. So we've seen a lot of nominations come and go. We've seen a number of presidents come and go. But I've never seen anything quite like this. I'd asked my staff to compile for me through yesterday the number of folks who had either called us or emailed or sent us letters on the nomination of Betsy DeVos to be Secretary of Education. And as of yesterday, over 3,700 people had contacted my office, over 3,700. Now, that may not be a lot from Oklahoma. That may not be a lot from California. That's a lot in Delaware, 3,700. I asked my staff to break it, let us know if we'd heard from anybody outside of Delaware, and over 700. And then I said, for the folks who've contacted us from Delaware with respect to this nomination of Betsy DeVos, I said, how many were for her? Out of 3,700, over 3,700, 10. I've never seen anything like that. And so that means there are over 3,700 people who, in my state, raised their voice against her nomination. Now, just because the numbers are like 370 to 1 against the nomination, that doesn't necessarily mean I should oppose the nomination, but it certainly makes me stop and think if I had been inclined to do so. But Mr. President, I rise today not just as a United States senator, but as a recovering governor and a father, one who knows the value of public education, really from personal experience. My wife and I grew up, she in North Carolina, and I in West Virginia, a little bit in Ohio, and mostly Virginia. But we grew up in public schools. Our sons attended public schools throughout high school, graduated, and went off to college, and we're proud of what they've accomplished. They're 26 and 28 years old today. Very proud of what they have accomplished. I was stepson for my first marriage. He lives in Michigan, raised a family of 4 children, his wife, and very proud of what he accomplished. Again, a product of public schools. When I graduated from high school, I was fortunate to win a Navy ROTC scholarship and go off to Ohio State, worked a couple of jobs while I was going to school, and was able to become one of the first people in my family ever to go to college and to graduate from college. And spent 5 years as a naval flight officer during the Vietnam War, and at the end of the war, came back to the U.S. and moved to Delaware. And there, thanks to the GI Bill, and again, continued to fly as a reserve P-3 aircraft mission commander, was able to make ends meet and get a graduate degree in business administration from the University of Delaware. The 8 years I was governor from 93 to 2001, I spent a big part of those 8 years focusing on creating a more nurturing environment for job creation, job preservation. And our presiding officer has heard me wax on in our committee more often than he probably wants to remember about a major job of government, I don't care if you're state, local, federal, is to create a nurturing environment for job creation, job preservation. If families, if you've got breadwinners, people who are earning an income, making a way for themselves, the rest in our job is actually a whole lot easier. And one of the keys to that nurturing environment is to make sure that the young men and women coming out of our colleges, our high schools, our trade schools, have the ability to read, to write, to think, to use the technology, and to have a good work ethic and go out and be a good employer for any employer who might hire them. Public education is personal for me, and I've had this remarkable connection to it for really my whole life. In our little state, I visit schools almost every week. We have a program called Principal for a Day, and I've been Principal for a Day. It's a State Chamber of Commerce program. I joke and tell people I've been Principal for a Day for about half the schools in Delaware. It's not quite right, but probably 30 or more, which is a lot. And I keep running into kids who tell me where they went to high school. I said, well, I was your principal. Did you know that? And I said, only for a day. But it was a good day. And I learned a lot from doing that. I've mentored for probably a couple of decades, and a bunch of different kids, and trying to help be a good role model for them and give them extra person to be able to lean on and to count on. And just recently, I was over at a school a couple of miles from our home called Mount Pleasant Elementary, which is it's a terrific elementary school in the Brandywine School District in northern Delaware. And the teacher of the year there, teacher of the year for the state, was good enough to let me come by and to shadow her for part of her day and see what a really terrific teacher does. During the 8 years I was governor, one of the highlights of my year, every year, was the day that I would host in June at the end of the school year. We have 19 school districts, each school district pick their teacher of the year, but to have the chance to have for lunch the Delaware Teachers of the Year, and just to focus in their school districts, in their schools, in their classes, what was working to raise student achievement, and really to be inspired by all of them. I hear regularly from my constituents about the importance of public education. In fact, I was out running late Sunday afternoon, actually, into dusk, and was driving by the Wawa on Philadelphia Pike, and just north of Wilmington, and some guy came by and he rolled down his window, and as I ran along, and he said, "Don't vote for that Betsy DeVos." And I said, "Really? You can't get away from this." And but I hear it a lot, and I hear a message loud and clear. Many of our colleagues have covered this nomination at some length, but I think it bears repeating. And I would just say this: experience matters. Mrs. DeVos has, as far as I can tell, no experience in public education as a student, none as a parent, none as a teacher, none as a school administrator, and none. And maybe that alone should not disqualify her, but it's concerning. During her confirmation hearing, Ms. DeVos failed to answer the most basic questions relating to education policy. And she demonstrated, not just in my view, but certainly the views of a lot of the people who watched that, who shared their thoughts with me, that she was unqualified, really unprepared for what I think is a critical task. Many of my colleagues who support Ms. DeVos point to her experience in Michigan, but Ms. DeVos used her significant wealth and influence apparently to push an education reform agenda centered on vouchers, centered on for-profit charter schools that delivered questionable outcomes for students and taxpayers. Let me just say, I'm the governor who proposed legislation, signed legislation creating charter schools. I've been a champion of charter schools, public charter schools in my state and in our country. I've been a champion here in the Congress. I am not a champion of all the for-profit colleges and universities that we have. Some of them are very good, some of them are not. And I am concerned with the advent of for-profit charter schools, particularly those that aren't doing the job, getting the job done, and raising student achievement for the young men and women that are students there. Leading the Department of Education is a very big job. It is a very important job. The Secretary of Education is responsible for overseeing a budget of some $36 billion for K-12 education and $150 billion for higher education, as well as managing a portfolio of more than $1.2 trillion in outstanding federal student loans. I've been fortunate as a congressman, as a governor, as a senator, to work with any number of secretaries of education. In the administration of George Herbert Walker Bush, the administration of Bill Clinton, the administration of George W. Bush, and the administration of Barack Obama. Dick Riley, people like Dick Riley, former governor of South Carolina. People like Arne Duncan, who was just a great school leader in Illinois and for our country as well. And when I think of the giants that they were and the work that they did and how knowledgeable they were, how inspiring they were, how uplifting they were, that's the kind of leader that we need. And they weren't just all in Democratic administrations or Democrat and Republican administrations. And as much as ever, we need that kind of leader today. I just conclude, Mr. President, by saying that Ms. DeVos too often lacks experience. Just as often has the wrong experience that we should expect from someone to lead the Department of Education at what is really a critical junction for our country. I cannot support her nomination because I'm not convinced that she's interested in bringing Democrats and Republicans together on a shared vision of improving public education in this country. And reluctantly, I must urge my Democrat and Republican colleagues to listen to this groundswell of voices from across the country and ultimately oppose this nomination. Thank you very much.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, as the Senate deliberates the nomination of Betsy DeVos to be Secretary of Education, I've heard from more than 4,200 Marylanders who called my office, more than 3,700 Marylanders who emailed me, countless others who sent me messages via Twitter and Facebook, and as Senator Carper has indicated, those who have just stopped me on the streets and urged me to oppose her nomination. They have contacted me to express their strong support for public education, and they're concerned about whether Mrs. DeVos is equally committed to public schools. I share their concern. Marylanders and I agree that our children deserve an advocate in this position who will work to strengthen the ability of public school educators to serve our children. Mr. President, as a proud graduate of the Baltimore City Public Schools, I understand the transformative powers of quality public school education can provide a child. The education I received at city schools has allowed me, the grandchild of immigrants, to represent Maryland in the United States Senate. I owe that to my public education, my public school education. Maryland has made a commitment to providing adequate funding for public education over the past decade. Consequently, Maryland has consistently been a national leader in student performance and student outcomes. Each day, our state's nearly 880,000 students make their way to classrooms of more than 60,000 educators and thousands of more support personnel and education leaders in over 1,400 Maryland schools. I appreciate the service of Maryland educators, not only from the perspective of a lawmaker, a father, and a grandfather, but also as a husband of a former school teacher. Mrs. DeVos appeared before the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee to articulate her view on how to best serve our students as Secretary of Education. I found several of Mrs. DeVos's answers to the committee questions to be troubling, particularly what appeared to be her tepid support for our nation's public schools, her failure to recognize the critical federal civil rights safeguards for children with disabilities, her inability to offer an opinion on longstanding debates within the education community that she would be expected to join as Secretary of Education, her support for President Trump's dangerous campaign promise to eliminate gun-free school zones, and her overall lack of response on how to provide students and their families with affordable higher education. Maryland families know and understand the value of a high-quality public school education. Since 2008, enrollment in our state public schools has increased by nearly 36,000 students to a record enrollment of approximately 880,000 students for the 2016-17 school year. While enrollment has continued to increase at a record pace, I'm proud that Maryland Public Schools have consistently ranked among the top 5 public school systems in the country. I worry that Mrs. DeVos' enthusiastic support for private school choice programs could hamper the progress in state and local education in Maryland and could prevent us from providing the highest quality level of education for our public school students. School choice programs that shift federal fund dollars from public schools to defray tuition at private schools weaken the ability of Maryland's hardworking public school professionals to deliver college and career-ready education for Maryland's diverse students. Certainly, private schools play an important role in our education system, and as Senator Carper points out, I support charter schools within our public school system. I support the role that public schools play, but we mustn't forget that more than 91% of American children attend public schools. They and their families deserve a Secretary of Education who will fight to strengthen public as well as private education. School choice programs are not one-size-fits-all solutions to strengthen education in the United States. They leave out students in our rural communities, for instance, and have been shown in Maryland, for most part, to support students who are already enrolled in private schools. I urge our Secretary of Education nominee, if she is confirmed, to work to provide our public school teachers with the training, tools, and resources necessary to provide all children with a high-quality education. I was particularly concerned by Mrs. DeVos' apparent unfamiliarity with critical federal civil rights safeguards for children with disabilities guaranteed under the 1975 Individuals with Disability Education Act, IDEA. IDEA ensures that every child with disabilities is afforded a free, appropriate public education. Across my state, more than 100,000 children receive federally funded services under the IDEA to help them succeed academically. Mrs. DeVos didn't seem to know that states must follow this critical civil education right law if they accept federal funding. Parents across the country advocate for their children on a daily basis, utilizing the protection afforded to their children under IDEA. They deserve a Secretary of Education who understands her responsibilities and the federal government's responsibilities to children with disabilities. Last year's enactment of the bipartisan, bicameral Every Student Succeeds Act was a true success. This was an incredible accomplishment put together by Senators Alexander and Murray. For the first time in 14 years, Congress reauthorized the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, legislation that was first enacted 50 years ago as part of the Civil Rights era to ensure that all of our children are able to attain a high-quality education. That act eliminated the outdated and ineffective accountability system of adequately yearly progress and now provides states with the flexibility to design their own accountability systems to identify, monitor, and assist schools in need of improvement to best educate their students. We gave local flexibility but maintained accountability. That was a major improvement in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. The modifications allow states to move away from reliance on a collective set of test scores to measure students' proficiency. Now states will be able to design accountability systems that take into account student growth over the course of a school year. As Secretary of Education, Mrs. DeVos would be tasked with leading the federal implementation and review of the state-developed accountability systems. But at our hearing before the committee, she struggled to understand the definition of proficiency versus growth and had to have committee members help her define those terms. Maryland educators opposed the high-stake testing requirements under the previous federal accountability system. They deserve a Secretary of Education who understands the basic concepts of federal involvement in our public schools so they can effectively advocate for more accurate accountability systems that better show student growth in the classroom. Mrs. DeVos' expressed support for President Trump's misguided pledge to eliminate gun-free school zones is deeply concerning. Maryland's families have made it loud and clear to me that this approach is wrong and would unnecessarily put our students in harm's way in the very classrooms which they are expected to learn. Since 2000, there have been 4 school shootings across my home state. One shooting in school anywhere in our country is too many. Each of these incidents is a tragedy, and I do not wish to see more students and educators put at risk of additional tragic incidences of gun violence by allowing firearms in our classroom. Rather than support the federal programs developed under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act to provide additional funding for school-based mental health resources in our national public schools that can provide assistance for those who may commit gun violence in schools, Mrs. DeVos would spend those tax dollars on school choice programs and open up our classrooms to potential violence. In the coming months, future college students and their families will sit at their family kitchen tables to apply for financial aid to pay for college and await the news of their acceptance to the college of their choice. Mr. President, I've talked to so many Marylanders who are struggling with allowing their children to go to schools of higher education that they know they're could be best prepared, but looking at the realities of the costs involved in higher education. This is an exciting time, yet increasingly anxious time for parents and students as the cost of attending our colleges continues to rise. Mrs. DeVos needs to demonstrate that she is familiar with the process and steps necessary to apply for federal financial student aid and appreciates the enormous burden families increasingly undertake to gain a foothold in the middle class through higher education. Mr. DeVos appears willing to roll back protections for student borrowing and to allow taxpayer funds to be put at risk at failing for-profit schools that do not provide students with the education and skills necessary to join the workforce. At a minimum, I would expect her to be an advocate to make sure that federal funds are not used for these schools that are not being held accountable for what they do. I would like to hear Mrs. DeVos voice her support for America's College Promise Plan to provide academically successful students with the ability to earn the first 2 years of their college degree tuition-free at a community college. So far, I don't think she has said anything. That's the most efficient way to try to educate our children. I appreciate Mrs. DeVos' willingness to serve, and I believe she is sincere in her beliefs, but I am concerned that those beliefs, if enacted, would harm the capability of America's public education system to serve the vast majority of students across the nation and pile a needless cost to students, their families, and the American taxpayer. Therefore, I will stand with Maryland students, teachers, and parents in opposing Betsy DeVos for Secretary of Education. With that, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I've had the opportunity over the last almost 24 hours now to hear from a wide swath of our conference, Democratic conference, speak out against a nomination because they feel so strongly that in this country, public education is a core principle. I know a number of my colleagues will be participating with me in these last few minutes, but I want to again thank everyone who has written, who has called in, who has expressed their opinion on this critical nominee that this president has tapped to oversee education policy. And
Mr. President, will the speaker yield to a question? Does the senator yield?
I will yield to a question from the senator from Hawaii.
I thank the ranking member of the HELP Committee, the senior senator from Washington. You can trace the history of public education in America to the original 13 colonies. In 1635, boys in Boston could get a free education, and by 1647, the Massachusetts Bay Colony required every town to provide boys a basic education. Some 340 years later, our public education system has come a long way, but some things don't change. Our communities still understand how public education lays a foundation of success. It's still the great equalizer. Senator Murray, during Betsy DeVos's hearing, you asked a very important question. You asked, can you commit to us that you will not work to privatize public schools or cut a single penny from public education? And Mrs. DeVos responded by saying she would work to find common ground and give parents options. And I'm wondering whether you were satisfied with her answer and her commitment to the basic premise of public schools and public education.
Well, I thank the senator from Hawaii for his question, and he is absolutely right. I did ask the Betsy DeVos when she came before our committee if she would commit to not privatizing our schools or cut a single penny from public education, and she would not do that. She would not do that. To me, that sends a very clear message, and it did obviously to parents and students and administrators across this country, that she was not committed to the core principle of public education, that our tax dollars in this country always have and should continue to be, to make sure that every student, no matter where they are, will have the opportunity to participate in education. Her answer clearly meant that she was going to take money from our public education system, from our schools, big, small, rural, and urban and suburban, to go to private schools. And that would mean a devastation for many communities. So I thank the senator from Hawaii for his question. I will yield to the senator from New Hampshire.
Thank you very much. I have been very concerned, Senator Murray, as you know, with Mrs. DeVos's lack of understanding of issues facing students with disabilities. My son Ben's experience in public education was made possible because there were so many families and advocates, educators who came before my family to make his inclusion possible. And before IDEA, students who experienced disabilities in an institutional setting often didn't get an education at all and could and were often mistreated. Yesterday when I spoke on the floor, I discussed a woman in New Hampshire named Roberta who had been in our state school before IDEA was passed and gave accounts of terrible experiences there. Do you also have concerns with Mrs. DeVos's lack of understanding of the challenges faced by students who experience disabilities and her lack of commitment to ensuring that all students have a free and appropriate public education?
Well, Mr. President, I deeply share the concern of the senator from New Hampshire. She came to the floor last night to speak eloquently about the challenges that our students with disabilities have and the promise that this country has made now for decades, that if you are a student with disability, you will be able to go to a public education school and get the education that you need. She spoke eloquently, and for everyone who didn't hear her, I ask you to go back and look at the record and listen to it. And yes, I am deeply concerned that this nominee that this president has sent to us not only is not committed to that basic premise that no matter who you are or where you come from or what you look like or if you have a disability, you have a public education. I'm not only concerned that she doesn't have a commitment, I am deeply concerned that she didn't even understand that it was current federal law. How can someone be a Secretary of Education in this country and not understand that basic premise and not give that commitment to people across the country, that if it's your child or someone you love or someone you know, they too can go to school and get what they need. So I want to thank the senator from New Hampshire, and yes, I am deeply concerned, as we all should, in this body and across the country, that this nominee is not prepared or qualified to make that basic assurance for all students in this country.
Mr. President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Mr. President, my mom was a second grade teacher, and she taught second grade until she was 70 years old. That was her life's work. And I went to public school, and I sent my daughter to public school, and it's really been the core of how I ended up in the United States Senate. And after a close review of Ms. DeVos's confirmation record and the hearing, I've concluded that, like all of my colleagues on the Democratic side and two of our colleagues on the Republican side, that I cannot support her. I don't believe she's prepared for this job, and I don't believe that she's committed to the kind of public education that got my family from an iron ore mine in northern Minnesota to the United States Senate. And my question of Senator Murray is that one of the most troubling examples of this lack of preparation came when Ms. DeVos was questioned by my colleague, Senator Hassan, who just spoke, and Senator Kaine about whether schools should meet the standards outlined by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. She said she would leave this decision to the states. As I noted yesterday, I occupy the Senate seat once held by Minnesota's own Hubert Humphrey. He was someone who, of course, was never at a loss for words. He delivered a speech at the Minnesota AFL-CIO 40 years ago, and one line of that speech is just as appropriate today as it was back then. He said, quote, "The moral test of government is how that government treats those who are in the dawn of life, the children, those who are in the twilight of life, the elderly, and those who are in the shadows of life, the needy, the sick, and the disabled." These civil rights protections and the funding that we've seen under IDEA have always been an area of bipartisan cooperation. And I have heard from so many parents in my state, a mom from Watertown who has a son that was born with Down syndrome, who says that thanks to IDEA, this law has given her the opportunity for her son to participate in a normal education. A woman from Lakeville, her son was born with developmental disabilities in the late 1980s. She was so worried about what his future would be, and then that law was in place, and today he's a successful young adult who happily lives, learns, and works in his community. So my question of Senator Murray is what her views are of the nominees' qualifications when it comes to the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the concern that she's heard from others in her state as well as across the country when it comes to this very important issue for our children.
Mr. President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, I want to thank the senator from Minnesota who came the other night to talk passionately about her own mother, who was a teacher, and her favorite course to teach was about the monarch butterfly. And how she would come dressed up as a butterfly, and how she impacted a young student in her classroom who is now a young adult and still remembers the learning experience that her mother as a teacher gave to him. That spark that is so important for every child in this country, that spark for education, no matter who you are, your disability, or what brings you to school that day, is what is so important about the word public education. That every child in this country deserves a public education and to reach their full potential, no matter what they look like or how they are, how they come to school that day, whether they've been fed or have a disability. That spark is what's so important. It's why so many people have spoken out in this country about this nominee who knows nothing or very little about IDEA, even that it is a federal law that under the jurisdiction of the department that she's seeking, she would oversee and protect those students. That to me is deeply disappointing and says to me that this president should say, I don't want this nominee to go forward. I will send you someone who understands this law. So I appreciate the question from the senator from Minnesota.
Mr. President, would the senator yield for a question?
I will yield for a question.
Senator, it's my understanding that the essence of Ms. DeVos's career has been an effort to impose on states programs, and now on the federal government program, that will take money out of public schools to provide to parents and students to then go to private schools. Is that a fair characterization of the essence of her career, is that parents should have a choice with public money to decide whether they want to attend a public school or a private school?
The senator is correct. The essence of what she has promoted, used her vast wealth for, and has worked for it throughout her experience, is to take money away from public education and put it into private schools.
So I'm confused. We just had an election, and in my state, the reddest part of my state are parts of my state where there are no private schools. Rural Missouri, I'm a daughter of rural Missouri. My father went to public school in Houston, Missouri. My mother went to public school in Lebanon, Missouri. I attended public school in Lebanon, Missouri, and Columbia, Missouri. In fact, I am a product of public education from beginning to end. Both of my parents went to the University of Missouri, and so did I. In rural areas of this country, there are not private schools for parents and kids to choose. They would have to drive miles. And by the way, in my state, the newly elected governor just cut transportation funds for public schools. Just cut them. So they now have less money for transportation than they had last year. And by the way, it isn't like public schools are getting fully funded in my state. They're not. So I guess what I'm confused about, and I know what public schools mean to rural Missouri. I know they are the essence of the community. If the essence of this woman's career is to take money out of public schools in rural communities and put them in private schools that will never exist in many of these small communities, they are kicking in the shins the very voters that put them in power. And I don't get that. I don't get that, Senator. I don't understand how you can give the back of your hand to rural America with this decision. And I would implore my colleagues who understand that rural America is where their base is in a large part, that they are misreading this vote if they think rural America is going to forget that this woman wants to rob the public schools of rural America and put it in private schools in the cities, which they will never be able to attend. Thank you, Senator.
I want to thank the senator for her question, and I just want to say she's absolutely right. The money is not magic. It doesn't just get printed to give vouchers to schools. It comes from our public schools, and as she stated so eloquently, many schools, some in rural, some in urban, mostly in rural, there's no private school to send your kids to. That voucher money, that public money, that taxpayer dollar money will come away from those schools. They will have less money, but it won't go to the advantage of those students, and they will be left behind. So I appreciate—
Distinguished Senator, yield for a question.
I will yield to a question from
Thank
Senator
you very much. And before asking my question, Mr. President, I want to thank the senior senator from Washington State for her leadership and passion on behalf of my children, on behalf of myself as a product of a small rural school in northern Michigan, my 2 children who went to public school, my 2 grandchildren who are now going to public schools. I want to thank you for your leadership, and so grateful to all of our colleagues and our 2 Republican colleagues that are joining us today. Would you agree that when we look at this, and I certainly have a bird's eye view, we in Michigan have lived what has happened in cutting public schools and moving dollars to private, for-profit, nonprofit charters without virtually any accountability. Would you agree that essentially we have a nominee that is looking through a lens of a private sector for-profit model, where in the private sector we have winners and losers? And so you can have a business open and close, and that's based on our private marketplace. It works well. But that in education, it's different, that we can't afford losers, for any of our children to be losers in education, and that it just doesn't work to have this competitive marketplace, that what we need is a quality public school along with public choices. I support public charters with accountability and other choices, but what we have is a view of a nominee, someone who's not been involved in public schools herself or her children and so on, that comes at it from this perspective of winners and losers in the private market, and we cannot afford any child to be a loser as it relates to their education.
Well, I want to thank the senator from Michigan for that question, because it's at the heart of what this entire debate is about. We have a nominee who's come forward, who's quite successful in private business, a billionaire herself, whose idea and vision for our nation's education comes from a private business perspective. And the senator from Michigan is absolutely right. Our schools are not about profits. They're not profit centers, and we can never run them that way, because there is a core principle that this country was founded on, that our forefathers very wisely thought of, that they wanted to make sure that every young person in this country, no matter who they were or how much money they had, would get a public education. You can't run that as a for-profit business, because there are kids who come to our schools that are very hard. They've come maybe without having had a parent home the night before. They come hungry. They come with disabilities. They come with challenging education experiences. We can't throw those kids out because there's other kids who come with parents who are very active and are really bright, and we want to keep them because they're better for profit. We have to run our public education schools so that every child has that opportunity, because who knows who that young child is going to be that takes that nugget of public education and ends up sitting here in the United States Senate. That's the foundation of our country. And I really appreciate the senator from Michigan for raising that, because that's really at the core essence of why so many people have spoken out against this nominee, who stood up and written us letters and made phone calls and stood at rallies and spoken out. Many people have never spoken out on issues before, who've never really paid attention before, but this is about that core principle our country was founded on, a public education for all. Not a profit education for all, but a public education for all.
Mr. President, would the senator from Washington yield for a question?
I will yield to the senator from Oregon.
Well, I appreciate your point and the belief that the son or daughter of a millwright, of a mill worker, as I was, should have the same opportunity to thrive as the son or daughter of a CEO of a big company. That's embedded in the notion of quality public schools. What I was really struck by was that DeVos wants to divert all of these funds from our public schools to for-profit schools. And if it's for-profit, you squeeze down the services in the school to maximize the profit. And that's just exactly the type of attack on our children that we can't tolerate. But I was also struck by she opposes accountability for these alternative schools. The columnist Stephen Henderson of the Detroit Free Press said, largely as a result of DeVos's lobbying, Michigan tolerates more low-performing charter schools than just about any other state. It lacks any effective mechanism for shutting down or even improving failing charters. And he goes on to say, we're a laughingstock in national education circles and a pariah among reputable charter school operators who have not opened schools in Detroit because of the Wild West nature of the educational landscape here. Do you share the concern about the complete lack of accountability for these for-profit schools that are pulling the funds out of our public system in Michigan?
Well, let me thank the senator from Oregon for his question, because he raises a very important point. No one is debating whether or not we want our kids to have a choice. The debate here is about whether or not those schools that take taxpayer dollars through a voucher system are accountable to the taxpayers who are paying for those vouchers. And this nominee came before our committee and very clearly stated that she would not equally hold accountable private schools. Now, I was a former school board member, and I can tell you, I was there late many nights listening to parents who stood before us and talked about the fact that they wanted to make sure their school had good teachers or their school had good policies. And we were accountable to that because we were an elected board, and we had to make decisions based on what our constituents felt was important. These are our constituents who are paying their tax dollars to this country, and they want to know that their taxpayers are used accountably. Yet we have a nominee before us at the Department of Education who has said that she wants to take those taxpayer dollars, your money, and send it to private schools with no accountability. So what can that mean? That can mean that those private schools don't necessarily have to provide a strong curriculum in specific topics. It means that they can let kids out of school and say, we don't want to keep you here anymore, you're too tough to teach. It can say that they won't keep records of dropout rates, so we know whether or not they're encouraging these tough kids to go to another school. They can actually deny access to students with disabilities or who come from tough backgrounds, who may not meet their standard. And they will not be held accountable under the policies that Ms. DeVos proposes. So the senator raises an absolutely critical question. At the end of the day, each elected official in this country is held accountable to their taxpayers to assure that the money they give out in their taxes is used in a way that our country agrees on. And this Secretary of Education says, nope, we want to change that. We
Well,
want your tax dollars to go to schools that are not accountable to you.
I thank the senator from Washington for your answer. And so often I've heard speeches about accountability from across the aisle. This is a case where accountability matters a tremendous amount because it determines whether or not our children have a fair shot at thriving in America. So thank you for elucidating us in regard to that issue.
Mr. President, we have a number of senators who've been on the floor, who are here now, who would like to speak, and I would like unanimous consent that I continue this dialogue with the senators until 11:45, and that the last 15 minutes be equally divided between the chairman of the committee and myself.
Is there objection? The senator from Tennessee.
That would mean the chairman of the committee would speak last.
Mr. President, let me revise that. I would ask unanimous consent that we continue to have this conversation until 11:45, that at 11:45 I'll give my final remarks and divide equally the last 15 minutes so the chairman of the committee has the last 7.5 minutes.
I have no objection.
Is there objection?
Thank you. Thank
Without
you,
objection.
Senator from Illinois, I think wants to ask a question.
Will the senator yield for a question?
I will yield to the senator from Illinois.
I do not believe that the president nominated the best candidate to serve as Secretary of Education. I don't believe he even nominated a qualified candidate. Ms. DeVos has never taught, never worked in a school system, and has no educational degree in education policy. I was hoping that she would ease my concerns over her qualifications at her confirmation hearing and prove that she was indeed up to the job. But instead, Ms. DeVos failed to study, showed up unprepared, and appeared unfamiliar with a foundational civil rights law that guarantees every student, including those with disabilities, the right to a quality, equitable education. I wouldn't be here today were it not for strong public schools and civil rights protections. Confirming her to lead the agency tasked with educating our children and helping them develop into successful adults would be a mistake for our children, because they would have to pay for and live with this mistake for decades to come. There's simply no way that I can support her nomination. And I asked the senator, how is it possible that we could have a Secretary of Education who does not understand or even know about those federal protections for students with disabilities to have access to equitable and fair education?
I want to thank the senator from Illinois, who is an amazing new and great member of our Senate, comes from Illinois and comes from an incredible background, who's asking a critical question about whether or not our students with disabilities should have access to education. It is a passion many of us feel about. It is a principle that our country has supported, and it is a principle that this nominee is uniquely unknowledgeable about. And to me, that is reason enough for any of us to vote against that nominee.
Would Senator Murray yield for a question?
I yield to the senator from Minnesota for a question.
Thank you. As senators on opposite sides of the aisle, we often have philosophical differences. But one thing I think we all agree on is that our cabinet secretaries must be qualified and up to the challenge of running an agency. Betsy DeVos has demonstrated that she is not qualified to run the education department. I would say to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, if you watched her confirmation hearing, you would know that. It was the most embarrassing confirmation hearing I have ever seen. She could not answer the most basic questions about education. So I ask my Republican colleagues, if Mrs. DeVos's performance in this hearing didn't convince you that she lacks the qualifications for this job,
What would have had to have happened in that hearing in order to convince you? If we cannot set aside party loyalty long enough to perform the essential duty of vetting the president's nominees, what are we even doing here? Let's do our job for the sake of the children, for the sake of our nation's future. Thank you.
Thank you to the senator from Minnesota, and I want to thank him for being a tremendous part of our committee and really helping us all recognize that this nominee is not qualified. And I see the senator from Hawaii who has, I believe, the last question on our side.
Mr. President,
Senator from Hawaii.
will the senator from Washington State yield to a question?
I will yield to the senator from Hawaii.
My question to you, as we have spent many hours debating whether or not Betsy DeVos is the best person to head our Department of Education, my question to you is, do you think that Betsy DeVos is the best prepared, the best experienced, the best committed person to lead the Department of Education? And if, with your indulgence, Mr. President, I'd just like to put this into a little bit of a context, because we talk about how foundational public schools are and that education is the great equalizer. And I do speak from experience as an immigrant who came to this country not speaking any English, and I learned from the public schools and the committed teachers in our public schools how to read and write English, to develop my love of reading, to count on an education system that would prepare me for success, not only in school, but in life. And that is why I want to also ask my colleague from Washington State, for the nearly 200,000 young people in Hawaii who attend our public schools, and obviously the millions of young people in our public schools throughout the country, do you think that Betsy DeVos is the best that we can do for these people who are attending our public schools?
I thank the senator from Hawaii, and I think that's the question all of us should be posing to ourselves as we get down to the final few minutes. Is this the best of the best? Is this a knowledgeable candidate who understands the federal law? Is this a candidate who comes to us without conflicts of interest? Is this a candidate who is willing to stand up and be the defender of all young children in this school? And to me, and I think to many of my colleagues who've been out here speaking, she is not. So I want to thank all of my great colleagues who've been out here speaking from their heart about a passion that they have in this country for a candidate to lead the Department of Education that is qualified, that is prepared, that is ready to stand up and fight for every child, no matter where they live or where they come from. With that, Mr. President, I believe we are down to the last 15 minutes before this, and the time is equally divided.
Correct.
Mr. President, as I noted, Democrats have been here on the Senate floor for the past 24 hours straight, talking about the importance of public education, sharing stories from parents and students and teachers in our home states, highlighting all of the reasons for senators to stand with us and stand with their constituents, stand with other Republicans who are doing the right thing, and urging them to say no to Betsy DeVos and her plans to privatize public school and destroy public education in America. But, Mr. President, I come to the floor today to make one final push before this vote, to make the case one last time, because we are so, so close, and because this is so important. And because we have a real shot right now to show people across the country that the United States Senate can actually listen to them, that their voices matter, and that their senators put them and their kids and their families and their futures above loyalty to a party or a president. Mr. President, I have talked about my frustration at the fact that Republican leaders did everything they could to jam this nominee through the Senate, cutting corners and rushing into a hearing before her ethics paperwork was in. blocking Democrats from asking more than 5 minutes of questions, forcing a vote before all of our questions were answered about her tangled finances and her potential conflicts of interest, and rushing straight from the committee vote to the shortest possible floor debate they could manage. So I won't spend more time on that today, because the truth is, despite Republicans' best efforts, people across the country have learned a whole lot about Betsy DeVos over the past few weeks. And the more they have learned about her, the less they have liked, and the more outraged they've become. Over the past few weeks, people have learned about Betsy DeVos's tangled finances and potential conflicts of interest, how she and her family have given hundreds of millions of dollars to Republicans and extreme conservative groups. They've learned about her failed record, how she spent her career and her inherited fortune pushing anti-public school policies that have hurt so many students in her home state of Michigan and across the country. They've learned about the extreme right-wing ideology that drives her, how she wants to bring her anti-government, free market above all philosophy to an education system that she has called nothing more than, quote, an industry and a dead end. And Mr. President, when people saw her in her hearing, they learned even more. When they watched Betsy DeVos in that hearing room, when they saw it live on the evening news, on The Daily Show, on The View, and on many other shows covering it, on one of the many clips that went viral in social media or shared by a friend or a family member, a whole lot of people were introduced to Betsy DeVos for the first time in that hearing, and they were not impressed. Mr. President, people across the country saw a nominee who was clearly ill-informed and confused, who gave a number of very concerning responses to serious and reasonable questions. In that hearing, Betsy DeVos refused to rule out slashing investments in or privatizing public schools. She was confused that federal law provides protections for students with disabilities. She didn't understand a basic issue in education policy, the debate surrounding whether students should be measured based on their proficiency or their growth. She argued that guns needed to be allowed in schools across the country to, quote, protect from grizzlies. And even though she was willing to say that President Trump's behavior towards women should be considered sexual assault, she would not commit to actually enforcing federal law protecting women and girls in our schools. And Mr. President, those were just a few of the moments in that hearing that made it clear why Betsy DeVos is not qualified to do this job. There were many more. What people saw in that hearing wasn't just a nominee who didn't understand the issues. They saw a nominee for Secretary of Education who clearly didn't think about public education and public schools the way that they did. For most people, public education hits really close to home. It's part of who we are, our families and our communities. So many of us owe everything we have to public education. We have watched our kids and our grandkids, our neighbors, get on the bus to go to their local public school. Many of us have taught in public schools or have family or friends who walk into classrooms every single day to help our students learn. And so many of us believe in a commitment to strong public schools that offer an education and opportunity to every student. It is a core part of the American promise. So when we saw someone nominated to this position who knows so little about public education, who so clearly cares so little about public education, whose strongest connection to public schools is through her dedication to tearing them down, well, that struck a real chord with a whole lot of people, and they decided to make their voices heard. Mr. President, over the past 2 weeks, we have seen an unprecedented level of engagement from people on this nomination. Tens of thousands of calls, thousands of letters, hundreds of people calling in, social media. Many of them had never been involved or made their voices heard before. Well, Mr. President, it made a difference. Right now, every single Democrat is opposing this nomination. 2 Republicans who've listened to their constituents are joining us. So we are dead even. First time in the history that the Vice President will be called on shortly to cast a tie-breaking vote on a cabinet nominee. We just need one more Republican to join us to prevent that from happening. One more to help us show the people across this country that their voice matters in this debate. One more to stand with people across the country and say no. So I'm here to finish this debate where we started, standing with students and parents and teachers, with the people of my home state of Washington across the country who strongly support public schools and true education opportunity for all. And with Democrats and Republicans across the country who have poured their heart and soul into opposing this nominee, I stand with you. I urge one more Republican to join us. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
Senator from Tennessee.
will you please let me know when 4 minutes have expired and then when 5 minutes have expired, and I'll allocate to the senator from South Carolina the last 2.5 minutes.
The chair will so notify.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm voting for Betsy DeVos because she will implement our law fixing No Child Left Behind the way we wrote it, to reverse the trend to a national school board and restore control to classroom teachers, to local school boards, to governors and legislators. Because she has been on the forefront of the most important public school reform in the last 30 years, public charter schools, and because she's worked tirelessly to give low-income children more of the same kind of choices that wealthy families have. 22 governors in this country support Betsy DeVos. I ask consent to put their names here, along with those of former Governor Jeb Bush, former Governor Mitt Romney, former Governor John Engler, and 452 organizations and elected officials who support Betsy DeVos for Education Secretary.
Without objection.
Was there not enough time to question her? I wonder, Mr. President. We treated her just like we did President Obama's education secretaries. She offered to meet with the Democrats in December. They refused. She finally met with them in their offices. Then she testified for 90 minutes longer than either of President Obama's education secretaries before our committees. Then follow-up questions. We asked President Obama's education secretaries 53 and 56 questions. They asked her 1,400 questions, and then they met, and one of their members announced that they'd all agreed to vote against her before she had a chance to answer the questions. Now, what does that say about those questions? She has conflicts of interest. We have a procedure for that, an independent conflicts of interest office, the Office of Government Ethics. The president's the head's appointed by President Obama, confirmed by the Senate. He has an agreement with every cabinet member about conflicts of interest. He wrote a letter to us 8 days before we voted on her and said she would have no conflict of interest if she followed this agreement. So plenty of time for questions, no conflict of interest. What's the problem? One, her support for public charter schools. Some people don't like that, but 2.7 million children attend that. They were founded by the Democratic Farmer Labor Party in Minnesota. They've now grown to 6,800 schools. They're the most effective public school reform in 30 years. Or school choice. What's wrong with giving low-income Americans more choices of better schools? We've done it since the GI Bill from 1944. Taxpayer money following veteran students to Notre Dame, Yeshiva, Harvard, Nashville Auto Diesel College. Has it hurt the public universities, of which I used to be president of one? It's helped them. Then more people went to private schools. Now more people go to public colleges. And Betsy DeVos is committed no more Washington mandates, no more national school board, no Washington mandates for vouchers, no Washington mandates for Common Core, no Washington mandates for a specific kind of teacher evaluation with Betsy DeVos in charge of the Department of Education. 1 year ago, we had no education secretary. I asked President Obama to appoint one, even though I knew he would appoint John King, with whom I disagreed. I promised that if he did, we would promptly confirm him, and we did. We asked him 53 questions, not 1,397. We didn't say he had conflicts of interest when the Office of Government Ethics said he did not. I know my friends are surprised about the election, but wouldn't they be really surprised if he appointed someone from within the education establishment to be the Secretary of Education? Would you be surprised that a Republican president would be for charter schools? Are you really surprised that a Republican president has appointed an education secretary who wants to give low-income children more choices of schools? Are you surprised that the Republican president has appointed an education secretary, nominated one, I should say, who wants to reverse the trend to a national school board and restore local control? I'm supporting her because she wants to do that, because she's led the most effective...
Senator has used 4.5 minutes.
Thank you. She's led the most effective public school reform movement over the last 30 years and of her commitment to help low-income children. I would say to my Democratic colleagues, we confirmed President Obama's first education secretary in 7 days on the day he was inaugurated, his second one in 3 weeks, just as we will Betsy DeVos today. You may disagree with the new president, but the people elected him. And I urge you to give the new Republican president the opportunity to choose his own education secretary, just like we did the Democratic president 8 years ago and a year ago, even though we disagreed just as much with their view of federal policy on local schools as you do with her policy and President Trump's policy on school choice.
2.5 minutes.
Mr. President, I urge a yes vote.
Mr. President.
The senator from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. President. As we close this debate on Betsy DeVos, this debate should really be about public education. I support public education. Education is the closest thing to magic in America. Let me say that again. Education is the closest thing to magic in America. I have experienced that magic as a kid growing up in a single-parent household, mired in poverty, disillusioned about life. I nearly flunked out as a freshman. I thank God for public education. But far too many kids, too many millions of kids today do not have a quality educational choice in their communities. And what does that mean? There is a high correlation between incarceration, high unemployment, and lower lifetime incomes for those students who do not have quality public education. This nation, the greatest nation on earth, has afforded a kid who almost dropped out of high school to become a United States Senator. Why? Because I found a path that included public education and quality public education. So what does it look like in some of our cities? Let me give you an example in Detroit. In English, only 9% of African American kids meet standards for English. 13% of white kids meet standards or exceed standards in English. 12.5% of Hispanic kids meet or exceed standards in English in Detroit. We need to make sure that every child in every zip code has a quality choice. The Secretary of Education cannot privatize education. That would take an act of Congress. So yes, we should have a passionate debate about education, and yes, we should make sure that the focus of that debate is on the kid.
The senator's time has expired. Pursuant Rule 4, Paragraph 2, the hour of 12 noon having arrived, and the Senate having been in continuous session since yesterday, the Senate will suspend for a prayer from the Senate chaplain.
Let us pray. God of mercy and light, we are in your hands, and we rejoice because of the power of your presence. Do with us what seems good in your sight. Lord, in the welter and variety of decision-making, with its alternating and fluctuating intricacies, give our lawmakers a deeper appreciation for a conscience void of offense toward you or humanity. today show mercy to the members of this legislative body. Let your sovereign hand be over them, and your Holy Spirit ever be with them, directing all their thoughts, words, and works for your glory. Lord, prosper the labors of their hands, enabling them in due season to reap a bountiful harvest if they faint not. We pray in your merciful name. Amen.
All post-cloture time having expired, the question occurs on the DeVos nomination. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Mr. Donnelly, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Perdue, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Bozeman, Cornyn, Grassley, Isaacson, Perdue, Rubio, Sass, Scott, and Tillis. Mr. Flake? Aye. Mrs. Gillibrand? Mr. Young? Aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Coons, Cortez Masto, Duckworth, Durbin, Franken, Gillibrand, Markey, Murray, Schatz, Schumer, Shaheen, Warren, and Whitehouse. Mr. Brown? No. Mr. Casey? No. Ms. Klobuchar? No. Mr. King? No. Ms. Stabenow? No. Mr. Kennedy? Aye. Mr. Reed? No. Mr. Hatch? Aye. Mr. Udall? No. Mr. Tester? No. Mrs. Capito? Aye. Mr. Bennett? No. Mr. Roberts? Aye. Mr. Van Hollen? No. Mr. Hoven? Aye. Mr. Sanders? No. Mr. Merkley? No. Mr. Murphy? No. Mr. Carper? No. Mr. Crapo? Aye. Mr. McConnell? Aye. Mr. Cochran? Aye. Mr. Donnelly? No. Mr. Rounds? Aye. Mr. Booker? No. Ms. Hassan? No. Mr. Cotton? Aye. Mr. Kane? No. Mrs. Ernst? Aye. Mr. Heinrich? No. Mr. Toomey? Aye. Mr. Warner? No. Mr. Moran? Aye. Ms. Murkowski? No. Ms. Collins? No. Mr. Wyden? No. Mrs. McCaskill? No. Mr. Langford? Aye. Ms. Hirono? No. Mr. Risch? Aye. Mr. Leahy? No. Mr. Inhofe? Aye. Mr. Graham? Aye. Mrs. Fisher? Aye. Mr. Paul? Aye. Mr. Gardner? Aye. Mrs. Feinstein? No. Mr. Sullivan? Aye. Mr. Cruz? Aye. Mr. Lee? Aye. Mr. Shelby? Aye. Mr. McCain? Aye. Mr. Cassidy? Aye. Ms. Harris? No. Mr. Peters? No. Mr. Nelson? No. Mr. Cardin? No. Ms. Cantwell? No. Mr. Menendez? No. Mr. Portman? Aye. Mr. Manchin? No. Ms. Heitkamp? No. Mr. Heller? Aye. Mr. Barrasso? Aye. Mr. Enzi? Aye. Mr. Corker? Aye. Mr. Blunt? Aye. Mr. Wicker? Aye. Mr. Blumenthal? No. Mr. Sessions? Aye. Mr. Burr? Aye. Mr. Johnson? Aye. Mr. Thune? Aye. Mr. Daines? Aye.
Sure. On this vote, the yeas are 50, the nays are 50. The Senate being equally divided, the Vice President votes in the affirmative and the nomination is confirmed.
President.
Majority Leader.
I move to reconsider the vote on the nomination.
Question is on the motion to reconsider.
I move to table the motion to reconsider.
Question is on the motion to table. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. And the motion to table is agreed to.
I ask unanimous consent the mandatory quorum call be waived.
Without objection.
Read one. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close debate on the nomination of Jeff Sessions to be Attorney General.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nominations of Jeff Sessions of Alabama to be Attorney General shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Mr. Donnelly, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain.
Oh, I'll be here.